Adolf Hitler, the name itself is basically a synonym for evil. But here's the thing. The man who was responsible for World War II and the Holocaust, he wasn't born a monster. And the story of how he became one is one of the most chilling and, honestly, one of the most important warnings in all of history. To really get it, we actually have to start at the very end. So picture this. It's 1945. Berlin is just a pile of rubble. Soviet soldiers are picking through the ruins outside this concrete bunker, and they find a charred corpse. It's him, the man who kicked off the deadliest war in human history and meticulously planned the murder of 6 million Jews. And in the end, he brought total destruction right back to his own doorstep. So that's the big question, right? How does a failed artist, a guy who was literally homeless for a while, this totally unremarkable Austrian, become the architect of genocide? The answer isn't some grand destiny. It's more like a perfect storm of personal failure crashing head-on into a moment of historical crisis. To understand the monster, you have to peel back the layers and look at the man. And what you find? Well, it's not a story about greatness. It's a life defined by mediocrity, a whole lot of resentment, and this deep, gnawing sense of failure. All right, first things first, let's bust a couple of common myths. You've probably heard this one, that Hitler's real name was Schicklgruber. Well, that was his father's original last name, sure, but his dad, Alois, legally changed it to Hitler way back in 1876. That's a full 13 years before Adolf was even born. And here's another one you might have heard, that Hitler's own grandfather was Jewish. Look, historians have combed through the records. There is zero evidence to back this up. It was just a political rumor that got started in the 1920s. And that's important because it means his horrifying antisemitism was a chosen ideology, not some twisted part of a secret family history. Far from being some kind of evil genius in the making, young Adolf was, well, he was a pretty mediocre student. He really struggled in school. And instead of hitting the books, he fell into this pattern that would pretty much define his entire life. He blamed everyone else, his teachers, his classmates, you name it. And he'd just retreat into this fantasy world where he was some kind of misunderstood genius. His big dream, his one great passion, was to be a famous artist. But in 1907, he applied to the big Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and he was rejected. So he tried again in 1908, rejected again. Their feedback was brutal, too. They basically said his drawings were unsatisfactory and he just didn't have what it takes. For Hitler, this was a massive, crushing blow to his ego, one he arguably never, ever recovered from. So, with his artistic dreams totally shattered and his inheritance all spent, Hitler just spirals. He ends up in real poverty, homeless on the streets of Vienna. And while he's living in these men's shelters, he's basically soaking up all the toxic political ideas that were swirling around the city at the time. This really aggressive German nationalism and a deep, hateful racial antisemitism. For years, he just drifted completely without purpose. And then, the summer of 1914 hits, the outbreak of World War I. This would become the single biggest turning point in his entire life. It gave the failed artist the one thing he'd never had, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. The army gave him everything that civilian life couldn't, a structure, a sense of belonging, and, for the very first time, actual recognition. He served as a dispatch runner, which was a seriously dangerous job, and he was decorated for bravery not once, but twice. He even got the Iron Cross First Class, which was an incredibly rare honor for a low-ranking corporal like him. In late 1918, he's in a military hospital recovering from a poison gas attack when the news comes through. Germany has surrendered. And by his own account, the shock just completely overwhelmed him. He even claimed it made him go blind again temporarily. But get this, he wasn't crying for his millions of dead comrades. He was crying for the collapse of the German Empire. He saw the surrender as a deep, personal betrayal, and it gave him a new, burning mission in life: revenge. So he comes back to a post-war Munich that is just in total chaos. It's reeling from defeat and revolution. This kind of political turmoil was the perfect fertile ground, a petri dish, really, for extremist politics, and for a man whose own personal hatreds could now latch on to a national cause. With absolutely no other job prospects, Hitler just stays in the army. His superiors notice his intense anti-communist rants, and they give him a new job, political informant.
And as part of these duties, he starts giving political education lectures to the other soldiers. And it's here, almost by complete accident, that he discovers his one true terrifying talent: the ability to hold a crowd completely spellbound with speeches just dripping with rage and resentment. So in September 1919, the army sends him to spy on a meeting of this tiny, pathetic little fringe group called the German Workers' Party. During a debate, Hitler just can't help himself. He jumps up and launches into this fiery tirade that just stuns everyone in the room. The party's founder immediately asks him to join, and Hitler sees his chance. This disorganized group was a vehicle he could mold, a tool he could control, and within just 2 years, he'd completely taken it over, renamed it the Nazi Party, and made himself its absolute, undisputed leader, the Führer. But his power didn't just come from his speeches or his ruthless political moves. No, to really understand his rise, you have to look at the incredibly powerful public image that was so carefully built around him. The great historian Ian Kershaw calls this the Hitler myth. And what it was this propaganda image of Hitler not as a politician, but as a hero, almost a messiah, sent by fate to rescue Germany. He was presented as this figure who was above all the dirty, petty squabbles of politics, someone who purely embodied the will of the nation. For a lot of Germans, this myth became way more powerful than the actual flawed man behind it. At a time of absolute chaos and national humiliation, this myth gave people a simple, powerful focus for all their hopes and all their fears. Here was the strong leader who would finally crush communism, restore order, and make Germany proud again. People weren't just voting for a political party. They were putting their faith in a man they saw as a savior. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, Hitler's rise to power was never inevitable. It wasn't destiny. It was the result of that perfect storm we talked about, a terrible convergence of factors, where a deeply disturbed individual met a deeply desperate nation at exactly the wrong moment in history. I mean, think about the ingredients, right? It's like a recipe for disaster. You take one man, simmering with decades of personal failure and resentment. You add an entire nation suffering from crippling economic chaos and humiliation after World War I. You mix that into a culture that already has a long, ugly tradition of antisemitism, providing a ready-made scapegoat. And then you amplify all of it with the new, powerful tools of modern propaganda. It was that specific toxic combination that created the monster. The story of Hitler's early years isn't just a history lesson. It's a warning. It shows us how ordinary feelings of resentment and failure, when they get fused with a national crisis and aimed at a scapegoat, can become something extraordinarily evil. Understanding how this happened once isn't just for a history test. It's the only way we can learn to recognize the warning signs, to make sure it never ever happens again. Which brings us to the final question. Have we?